I never expected it to happen like this. One day, everything seemed fine, normal even. I went about my daily life, going through the motions, assuming that nothing would change. There was a routine, a rhythm to how I lived. The sun rose and set. I did my work, talked to people, laughed at jokes. It was the sort of day where, if you were to ask me how I was, I'd say, I'm okay. Not because I was particularly happy, but because everything seemed to be under control. I had grown comfortable with the way things were, even if I didn't realize it at the time. But then it happened. The moment when everything came undone. It wasn't loud, not at all like what I had imagined a breakdown would be. There was no dramatic event, no screaming or crashing of glass. I didn't have a specific moment I could point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. It was subtler than that, almost like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, growing louder until I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was like a slow-motion collapse, where one by one, the things that held me together began to fall apart. It was the kind of thing that no one else would notice because on the outside, I looked the same. I went to work. I smiled. I nodded when people spoke to me. I tried my best to keep up appearances, convincing myself that I could handle it. But inside, I was breaking. The feeling crept up on me so gradually that by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. It's hard to explain what it feels like to be broken. It's not a physical thing you can touch or see, but it's there, inside you. I started feeling disconnected from myself, like I was a stranger in my own life. There was a growing sense of unease, like the ground beneath me wasn't as solid as I had always believed. I could feel the cracks forming, slowly spreading through everything I thought I was. The person I had been, the one who felt confident, who believed they had everything under control, was slipping away, and in their place was someone I didn't recognize. I began to notice the small things at first. I was more tired than usual, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Every morning I would wake up and feel like I hadn't rested at all. It felt like there was this heavy weight on me, making it harder to get out of bed, harder to move through the day. Things that used to bring me joy felt dull. Conversations felt empty. I started pulling away from people without even realizing it, convinced that no one could understand what I was feeling. There was this constant noise in my head, like static that wouldn't quiet down. It was the doubt, the fear, the anxiety, all the things I tried to ignore for so long, now refusing to be silenced. The harder I tried to push it away, the louder it became. I kept telling myself that I just needed to push through it, that it would pass if I ignored it long enough. But it didn't. The more I pretended everything was okay, the more I felt myself unraveling. I think the hardest part was realizing that I couldn't fix it. I had always been the kind of person who believed that I could handle anything that came my way. But this felt different. It wasn't something I could solve with logic or hard work. It was deeper, more personal, and it terrified me. I was losing control, and I didn't know how to stop it. After the breaking, there was only emptiness. It was like a vast, dark void had opened up inside of me, swallowing everything that had once made me feel alive. I tried to fight it at first, to resist the emptiness by filling my life with distractions, work, socializing, anything that could keep me busy enough to avoid facing what was happening. But nothing worked. The more I tried to escape it, the more it consumed me. The emptiness wasn't just a feeling, It became my reality. Everything around me started to lose its meaning. The things that once mattered to me, the things that used to make me feel connected to the world, felt distant and irrelevant. It was as if I was floating through life, unable to touch anything or anyone. I would go through the motions, but nothing felt real. Conversations became hollow, relationships felt fragile. Even the things that used to bring me joy, music, reading, being with friends, lost their color. I remember waking up in the morning, staring at the ceiling, and feeling nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a heavy, oppressive sense of nothingness. It was worse than pain, worse than any physical or emotional hurt I had experienced before, because at least when you're in pain, you know you're alive. But this felt like I was slowly fading away, like the essence of who I was disappearing, leaving behind a hollow shell of a person. I felt isolated in my emptiness. It was strange, because I wasn't alone. I had people around me, friends, family, co-workers, but none of them seemed to understand what I was going through, and I didn't know how to explain it to them. How do you tell someone that you feel like a ghost in your own life? That you're there, but not really there? That you're existing, but not living? So I didn't say anything. I kept it all inside, convinced that no one would understand. I thought that if I just pretended long enough, maybe the emptiness would go away on its own. But it didn't. It stayed with me, a constant presence that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I started to withdraw from the people I cared about. Not because I didn't love them, but because I didn't know how to be with them anymore. I didn't know how to explain why I couldn't engage with life the way I used to. Why everything felt so heavy, so overwhelming. And the more I withdrew, the more isolated I became. It was a vicious cycle, one that I didn't know how to break. The worst part was the guilt. I felt guilty for feeling this way, for not being able to snap out of it. I felt guilty for not being the person people expected me to be, for not being able to give them the version of myself that they had come to rely on. I felt like a burden, even though no one had said anything to make me feel that way. It was all in my head, but it was real enough to make me pull further and further away from the world. I didn't want anyone to see how broken I had become. I was terrified of being vulnerable, of showing people the cracks that had formed inside me. So I put on a mask. It was easier that way, or so I thought. I could pretend that everything was fine, that I was still the same person I had always been. I could smile, laugh, and engage in conversation without anyone ever knowing what was really going on beneath the surface. The mask became my shield, my defense against the world. I thought it was protecting me, keeping me safe from judgment and pity. But in reality, it was only making things worse. The more I hid behind it, the more disconnected I became from myself and the people around me. Every smile felt forced. Every word I spoke felt hollow. I was living a lie, and it was exhausting. I would go to social gatherings, laugh at jokes, and engage in conversations, all the while feeling like an imposter. No one knew the truth, and I convinced myself that it was better that way. But the mask was heavy. It weighed on me, pulling me deeper into my own isolation. I started to feel like I was living two separate lives. The one everyone saw, and the one that was hidden beneath the surface, where the real me was struggling to breathe. The more I tried to keep up the facade, the more it began to crack. There were moments when I couldn't hold it together anymore, when the weight of it all became too much to bear. But even in those moments, I tried to hide it. I would retreat into myself, shutting down emotionally, so that no one could see the pain. It became a habit, this constant pulling away, this constant need to protect myself from being exposed. I was afraid of what people would think if they saw the real me, the broken, fragile version of myself that I was so desperate to hide. I was afraid that they wouldn't understand, that they would see me as weak, or worse, as a burden. So I kept it all inside, burying the pain deeper and deeper until I didn't know how to reach it anymore. The mask that was supposed to protect me ended up becoming a prison. I felt trapped, unable to be myself, unable to connect with the world in a meaningful way. I longed for someone to see through the mask, to reach out and pull me out of the darkness. But at the same time, I was terrified of being seen. It was a constant push and pull, a desire to be saved, and a fear of being exposed. The mask had served its purpose for a while, but I knew that I couldn't keep wearing it forever. The longer I wore it, the more I lost touch with who I really was. I had built walls around myself, and now I didn't know how to tear them down. There comes a point when you simply can't run anymore. It's not that you decide one day to stop running. It's that your legs give out, your mind can't hold up the pretense, and you reach a place where everything you've been avoiding catches up to you. I remember the moment vividly. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation with anyone else. It was a confrontation with myself. After spending so much time hiding behind the mask, pretending that I was fine, I reached a breaking point where the weight of everything I had been carrying became unbearable. I couldn't escape it any longer. It was time to face the fragments of myself. At first, I didn't even know where to begin. I was afraid to look at the pieces of myself that had fallen apart, afraid of what I might find. What if I couldn't put them back together? What if some of them were lost forever? I had spent so long avoiding these thoughts that now, when I was forced to confront them, they felt overwhelming, like a tidal wave of emotions I had been holding back for years. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it was inevitable. I knew that I couldn't keep living the way I had been. Something had to change. I started small, with just one question. What happened to me? It wasn't an easy question to answer. I had no idea when exactly things had started to fall apart. There wasn't a single event I could point to, no clear cause for the way I was feeling. Instead, it felt like a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of who I once was. As I tried to piece together the timeline of my decline, I realized that I had been ignoring the warning signs for a long time. There had been moments, small moments, where I had felt the cracks forming, but I had brushed them aside, convinced that I could handle it, that it was just a phase, that it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. All those little moments had accumulated over time, like water wearing away at a rock. I had become so good at hiding my pain, so good at pretending that I was okay, that I had even convinced myself for a while. But now, sitting alone with my thoughts, I had no choice but to face the truth. I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay for a long time, and that realization hit me harder than I expected. Looking at the fragments of myself was painful. It felt like I was looking at a stranger, someone I used to know but had long since forgotten. There were parts of me that I recognized, The parts that were still strong, still resilient, but there were also parts that were shattered beyond recognition. These were the parts of me that had been broken by the weight of expectations, by the constant need to perform, by the relentless pressure to be someone I wasn't. I had lost touch with who I really was, and in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. One of the hardest things to accept was that some of those fragments were gone forever. I kept thinking that if I could just work hard enough, if I could just put in the effort, I could somehow piece everything back together the way it was before. But as I sat there, looking at the broken pieces of my identity, I realized that some things couldn't be fixed. There were parts of me that had been permanently altered by the experiences I had gone through, by the pain I had endured. I wasn't the same person I had been, and no amount of effort was going to change that. At first, this realization filled me with grief. I mourned for the person I used to be, for the parts of myself that I would never get back. I cried for the dreams I'd once had, for the confidence I'd lost, for the relationships that had suffered because I'd been too afraid to let anyone in. It was a deep, overwhelming sadness, and I let myself feel it fully. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain that I had been carrying. I didn't try to push it away or minimize it. I sat with it, feeling every ounce of its weight. But after the grief, something unexpected happened. In the midst of all the brokenness, I began to feel a sense of relief. It was a strange feeling, one that I didn't fully understand at first. But as I allowed myself to sit with it, I realized what it was. I was no longer running. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't trying to hold it all together. I wasn't hiding behind a mask. I was just me. Broken, yes, but real. I wasn't trying to be someone I wasn't, and that brought with it a kind of freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was in that moment that I realized something important. Being broken didn't mean I was beyond repair. It didn't mean that I was worthless or weak. It just meant that I was human. I had gone through things that had changed me. Yes, but those experiences hadn't destroyed me. They had shaped me, molded me into someone new. And while I might not be the person I once was, that didn't mean I couldn't become someone stronger, someone more resilient, someone who could carry the lessons of my brokenness with me as I moved forward. Facing the fragments of myself wasn't just about acknowledging the pain. It was also about understanding the strength that came from surviving it. I had been through so much, and yet I was still here. That meant something. It meant that despite everything, I hadn't given up. Despite the moments when I'd felt like I was drowning in the emptiness. Despite the times when I'd felt like there was no way out. I had kept going. I had endured. And that endurance was something I hadn't given myself enough credit for. As I continued to sit with the fragments of myself, I began to see them not just as evidence of my brokenness, but as pieces of a story of survival, of resilience, of growth. Each crack, each fracture told a story of how I had faced adversity and come out the other side. I wasn't the same person I had been, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, in losing parts of myself, I had made space for something new to emerge. This realization didn't come all at once. It was a slow, gradual process, and there were days when I still felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But little by little, I began to accept that being broken wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was just a part of my journey, a part of who I was becoming. The cracks in me were real, but they didn't define me. They were just a part of the story, not the whole of it. In the end, facing the fragments wasn't about putting myself back together the way I had been before. It was about accepting that some parts of me had changed, and that was okay. It was about recognizing the strength it took to survive the breaking, and about giving myself permission to rebuild in a new way. I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to be whole in the way I used to be. I just had to keep going, to keep moving forward, even if it was one small step at a time. Looking at the fragments was painful, why yes, but it was also freeing, because in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to hide anymore. I didn't have to pretend to be okay when I wasn't. I didn't have to carry the weight of other people's expectations. I could just be me, broken, yes, but also resilient, also strong, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Healing is not immediate. It's not something that happens in a neat, linear process. I used to think that once I acknowledged my brokenness, once I faced the reality of how far I had fallen, I would somehow find the strength to piece myself back together quickly, like solving a puzzle. But healing doesn't work like that. It is slow, messy, and often unpredictable. I had to learn to be patient, not just with the process, but with myself, and that was harder than I ever imagined. When I first began the journey of rebuilding, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I thought that once I had confronted the brokenness, the rest would be easier. But what I quickly realized was that confronting the broken pieces was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in learning how to live with them. There were no quick fixes, no easy solutions. Every day felt like a new battle, a new set of challenges that I wasn't always sure I was prepared to face. There were moments when I made progress, when I felt like I was taking small steps forward, but there were also days when I felt like I was right back where I started. And those days were the hardest. The setbacks, the moments of doubt, the times when I questioned whether I was ever going to feel whole again. I had to learn that healing wasn't about reaching some perfect state of being. It was about learning to navigate the ups and downs, about accepting that there would be good days and bad days. One of the first things I had to accept was that not everything could be repaired. There were parts of me that had changed in ways I couldn't undo, relationships that had been altered, dreams that I had to let go of. At first, this felt like another kind of loss, another layer of grief that I had to carry. I wanted so badly to return to the person I had been before everything fell apart, to reclaim the sense of certainty, the confidence, the joy I once had. But as I moved through the process of healing, I began to understand that this wasn't possible. The idea of going back to who I was before started to feel less like a goal and more like an unrealistic expectation. The person I had been wasn't coming back, and that was okay. I was becoming someone new, someone shaped by the experiences I had been through. And while there was still pain in that realization, there was also a sense of freedom. I didn't have to hold on to the past anymore. I didn't have to chase the person I once was. Instead, I could focus on becoming the person I was meant to be now. Part of the healing process involved letting go of control. I had spent so much time trying to control everything. my emotions, my thoughts, my relationships, my future. But control is an illusion, and trying to maintain it had only exhausted me further. I had to learn to surrender, to trust that even though I didn't have all the answers, I could still move forward. This was one of the hardest lessons to learn because it meant embracing uncertainty. It meant accepting that I couldn't plan my way out of this, that I couldn't force myself to heal faster or better. There were days when I felt like I wasn't making any progress at all. Days when I would fall back into old patterns, into the familiar numbness that had protected me for so long. But I started to recognize that even in those moments, I was still moving forward. Healing isn't about perfection. It's about showing up for yourself, even on the days when you feel like you're failing. It's about continuing to do the work, even when it feels like nothing is changing. Piece by piece, I began to rebuild. At first, it was small things, allowing myself to feel joy in moments where I would have normally shut down, letting myself cry when the weight of everything became too much, or reaching out to someone I trusted instead of pulling away. Each of these small steps felt monumental, like I was slowly reclaiming parts of myself that I thought were lost. There were also moments of deep reflection. I had to confront not just the external circumstances that had contributed to my brokenness, but also the internal beliefs that had kept me stuck. I had to unlearn the idea that being strong meant never showing vulnerability, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. I had to challenge the belief that I had to have it all together all the time, that being imperfect made me unworthy. These were deeply ingrained ideas, and letting go of them wasn't easy. But as I worked through them, I began to understand that real strength comes from being able to admit when you're struggling, from being able to ask for help, and from accepting yourself exactly as you are. As I rebuilt, I started to see the cracks in me differently. At first, they had felt like wounds, evidence of my failure, my inadequacy. But over time, I began to see them as marks of resilience. The cracks didn't define me, but they were part of my story. They were reminders of what I had been through, of what I had survived. I wasn't the same person I'd been before, and that was okay. In fact, it was better than okay. The cracks in me allowed me to see the world in a different way, to appreciate things I had once taken for granted, to connect with others on a deeper level. Healing also meant learning to live with uncertainty. There was no moment of arrival, no point at which I could say, I'm completely healed. Instead, I had to accept that healing was an ongoing process, one that would likely continue for the rest of my life. There would always be moments when I felt fragile, moments when the old fears and doubts resurfaced. But now, I had the tools to navigate those moments. I knew how to take care of myself, how to reach out for support, how to sit with the discomfort without letting it consume me. There were still days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when I questioned whether I was really making progress. But those days didn't define me. They were just part of the journey, a reminder that healing isn't a straight line. And on the days when I felt strong, when I could look at myself in the mirror and see someone who had survived, who had grown, those were the days when I knew that I was on the right path. I started to find beauty in the process of rebuilding. It wasn't about becoming perfect or erasing the past. It was about integrating the lessons I had learned, about accepting that the person I was becoming was shaped by both my strength and my brokenness. The cracks in me didn't make me weak. They made me whole, in a different way. They allowed the light to seep through in ways I hadn't expected. As I continued to rebuild, I found that I was more compassionate, not just toward myself, but toward others. I had a deeper understanding of what it meant to struggle, to feel lost, to be broken, and that understanding allowed me to connect with people in a way I hadn't been able to before. I no longer felt the need to hide behind a mask, to pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. I could be honest about my journey, about the ups and downs, and in doing so, I found that others were willing to share their struggles as well. There was a sense of shared humanity in our brokenness, a recognition that none of us are alone in this. The slow rebuild taught me that healing isn't about erasing the past or trying to return to who you once were. It's about moving forward, piece by piece, and accepting that the person you're becoming is shaped by everything you've been through. It's about learning to live with the cracks, to find strength in your vulnerability, and to embrace the idea that being broken doesn't make you any less whole. In the end, I realized that healing wasn't about finding some perfect version of myself. It was about learning to love the version of myself that existed right now, with all my imperfections, all my scars, all my cracks. It was about understanding that I didn't have to have it all together, that I didn't need to be perfect to be worthy of love, of happiness, of peace. The slow rebuild is ongoing. It's not a destination I've arrived at, but a journey I'm still on. And that's okay. I'm learning to be patient with myself, to celebrate the small victories, to acknowledge the setbacks without letting them define me. I'm learning to live with the cracks, to see them not as flaws, but as evidence of my resilience, of my ability to keep going, even when the road is hard. And perhaps most importantly, I'm learning that being broken doesn't mean you're beyond repair. It just means you've lived, you've struggled, you've survived. And in that survival, there is beauty, there is strength, there is hope.